Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm with George from Apogee. We're here at Namm 2025. What's like the basic model of interface that I could get from you? Like 2 channels, is it 1 or 2 channels?
Well, that's a good question. So we do mostly 2-channel interfaces. So for example, I've got here the Apogee Boom. This is probably our most accessible interface, and it's really designed to be so. A lot of people that are getting into music production, their whole thing is just, I want to be able to get into my computer, start making music. And to be honest with you, digital recording is a miracle. So absolutely, you should be doing this. But a lot of times when people get into it, they don't really understand what they're buying into. And so a lot of people will buy a lot of gear that ends up getting replaced in about 2-3 years. So one of the big challenges with developing the Boom was like, how do we make a starter interface that is something that a professional could also use reasonably and isn't something you will grow out of? So we did a number of things that are different than what your typical interfaces are doing. Probably the biggest of which is the fact that the Boom is not using a codec. And if you've never heard that term, that's fine. All it means is basically when you think about how people are making audio interfaces, so many of them are based upon a single chip that does everything. It handles your A to D conversion, your D to A conversion, basically how digital becomes analog, how analog becomes digital, and it has mic preamps built into it. And shockingly enough, whether you choose Focusrite or Universal Audio, many interfaces share that exact same chip. But the problem is that those compared to a bespoke D to A circuit and A to D circuit and a mic preamp that's meant to feed those stages is just going to be inferior. So what we've done in the Boom is we've taken the idea of this bespoke D to A, A to D circuit, implemented it in a lower cost device. We have a single mic preamp built into it, but it's actually legit quality. You can run things like an SM7B, which if you're doing home recording and you're trying to get a killer vocal performance, it's a really common choice because it's so rejected of the room. I don't know about you, but when I was getting started, a lot of times I was making records in bedrooms, dude. And in that scenario, condenser microphones are cool, but they're usually rather expensive, and it tends to be that that kind of microphone does not respond well to an untreated room. So with something like this, you're able to utilize the interface in such a way that you're not getting into problems with the equipment you're choosing to use with it, which just kind of tends to be why many starter interfaces people grow out of, because they'll buy an SM7B or they'll get high impedance headphones, and by the time that they're working with those pieces of gear, their interface is obsolete to where they are in their production style.
That makes perfect sense. So, how do you feel about the preamps on this interface? Do you think they hold up to something like the Neve 1073 or like these classic preamps that everyone wants to go and buy and everyone admires so much? How do you feel about these pre's?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, realistically, I love preamps. I'll be the first to tell you that like analog preamps, super cool stuff. You can get lots of vibey character out of various things, but when we think about what we're looking for in an audio interface, oftentimes what we're looking for is actually not a 1073. As cool as that is for certain sources, like let's say a U87 into a 1073 into your interface, chances are if you're recording like let's say a guitar DI, or you're taking in different sources that need to have a cleaner sound, these guys are actually really transparent, really clean. They're actually closer to something like a John Hardy or a Millennia in terms of how they function. And with having on this guy 64 dB of clean gain, it actually allows you to power these more intensive microphones. Like if you choose to use ribbons, you choose to use something like an SM7B, you'll actually be able to pump up the gain without making it so it's adding noise to the signal. And typically that's the big problem. Even though, funny enough, 1073s and other things are loved for their character that they impart on a signal, a lot of times the problem of interface preamps is that they're not clean enough. Most of the time, if they're imparting things, they're making distortion, noise, things that are super unpleasant and make your shit sound lower quality. So really, what we tried to do with the Boom was have this onboard preamp that was super clean, super transparent, and for people that want to use more color, yeah, we have line level inputs here that will accept up to like the max signal that you could imagine using in pro audio. Typically like plus 18, plus 20 signals. All those things you can still pipe in external preamps if you care to without getting into trouble in terms of how it will represent that information. But what's built in is going to be the most adaptable for the widest variety of stuff that you might have to interface with.
So on here there is a line input.
Yeah.
How much does this preamp or this interface going for?
These guys are going for $249.
Wow,
So super accessible to someone that wants to be able to get a mic hooked up into their computer and have accurate monitoring so they can make good mix decisions.
Yeah. This is actually, I didn't know that. So for $250, you're getting the Apogee quality conversion and an Apogee preamp.
Yeah. I mean, that's the first time we've done a product like this since probably the one back in the day. I don't know if you ever used one of those.
When was this released?
These guys came out in 2022, I believe.
Okay. Is there a two?
Maybe 2023. Forgive me, I'm wrong by a year.
Is there a two preamp version of this?
Good question. So we have the Apogee Boom, which is our entry point into this kind of product. We also have the Apogee Duet. And that was my actual entry point into Apogee back in the day because, as you know, I was a guitarist making records in bedrooms. And at the time, I had been using some lower quality stuff from PreSonus, which, to be fair, I was happy to start out on. But when I started plugging in microphones that were supposed to sound a certain way, I was like, oh, why doesn't my i5 on a guitar cab sound the same way I like on my records? Turned out, converters and preamps were the reasoning behind why, even though I thought I was using the gear that I saw people using, it did not sound the way I expected to. And so the Duet has two mic preamps built into it. These days, it's got USB-C as its format to connect. We can now run off of iPads and iPhones too, which is super cool if you don't necessarily always have a big travel rig with you. You can actually have just a really small, really simplistic setup and still make killer results. We still see big engineers using this Duet just for the headphone amp in it because it can power headphones that are way hungrier than most other interfaces could deal with. And because of that, a lot of people will buy these just for the monitoring on headphones alone as a companion to their larger studio interfaces.
So are the converters on the Duet and the Boom the same as your...
They're pretty darn close. I think there's maybe a dynamic range difference if we want to get super techie of maybe a decibel or two. But we're talking about something that is very much within the same sonic caliber here.
Right on. So then when it goes to 4, is there a 4-channel and an 8-channel version of these?
Good question. So once we go past these interfaces, we get into people that are going to be doing kind of different use cases. So if you've ever thought about outboard equipment, for example, or tracking a drum kit, or tracking multiple performers at once, you're probably going to be looking at something that has about 8 inputs in some way or shape or form.
Right now, like I just built a podcast, and when I was doing that, I needed an interface in my podcast studio, and I needed at least 4 channels because I'm eventually going to have at least 4 guests. And so I was looking for a 4-channel interface or an 8-channel interface. So I could get the use case for those, aside from just drums, is like the podcast.
Oh, totally.
Tons of people are building those right now.
Totally, and people scale podcasts to massive extents too. It's not unusual nowadays to see podcasts that have 6 guests or more, right? Yeah. So yeah, we can absolutely move to larger interfaces. Typically, once you go much beyond 2 channels or so, we get from a desktop interface into something like a rack mount interface. Just makes it more practical for the connections that are happening on it. So we'll take a look in a moment at the Symphony Studio, just recently released, and that's going to be a great way to go into higher scaled inputs and also top up what your recording fidelity can be.
Sweet, let's go take a look.
Sweet.
So what are we looking at over here?
So over here we've got our newest addition to the Apogee lineup. These guys have just launched. We've got the Symphony Studio in both the 8x8 and 8x16 configurations. We also have a 2x12 for those that are just getting into immersive audio. So if you've heard of Dolby Atmos before, we basically made some interfaces that make that process super easy. But for those of us that just need to have more inputs for the sake of integrating outboard gear or tracking multiple performers or drums, these provide more outputs and inputs. That way we can incorporate those larger workflows. And the cool thing is that these Symphony Studios are actually taking the converters from the first generation Symphony Mark II. It's been used in elite recording studios around the world, putting them in a more price accessible package, super transportable, and makes it so that it's certainly a much easier entry point into doing Dolby Atmos mixing, having all the monitor control stuff that's necessary for doing that kind of work into the interface, so you're not having to buy a $6,000 external monitor controller. Some of these products range between $2,000 up to about $3,500, and they sound as good as anything out there, truly.
Right on. So this is basically just an extension of those in a higher form. So 8 channels of what was already there for 1 channel and 2 channels. Does it sound the same?
They're actually a significant different sound, and I will say a lot of people don't really think about that all that much. But when you move from one interface to another, one of the things that improves is you can do more things with the analog circuit design, and especially the converter chips that are utilized in this process. Both of those are substantially different between things like even the Duet through the Symphony Desktop or Symphony Studio. these kind of interfaces in the Symphony lineup tend to have our most accurate imaging. So for people that are mixing especially, you're gonna really be able to tell a large difference in terms of how you hear your music. And it's something that a lot of people don't think about until they hear it, and then you take it away and it's like, oh my gosh, I can't work as well without this. Because your interface is not only responsible for the analog going into the digital domain, but the music inside your computer, when it plays back, goes through a digital to analog process. And one of the things that we're very known for is having really accurate transient response. So imagine like a kick drum, or just some big slam and sample that has this big old peak on it. Those kind of pieces of information on lesser interfaces tend to blend together, especially when there's lots of instrumentation happening. So what happens is, for example, as I move from my Duet to my Element and then into my Symphony, the thing I could notice is I could hear more separation of instruments. And rather than having to guess as to how my bass and my kick drum are playing together, I could distinctly hear them because the transient accuracy of that higher quality converter makes it so in a way it's more humbling because you're revealing more, but it's also much more accurate and allows you to make better decisions. So after a small little adjustment period, you really get to this point where it's like way easier to trust your ears in decision making. At the end of the day, music can be made on anything, right?
Yeah.
I've seen people legitimately record into voice memos on an iPhone and use that in a release. But let's be honest, that versus something that's the highest grade converter in the world, it's like you can become a great basketball player without having a basketball court at your house. But man, it is a lot easier when you get to work with the real equipment and be able to understand what those things are and how to interact with them more thoroughly. So I would dare say that even though, again, creativity should be the focus of music making, the tools are simply something that's much easier to do. Imagine taking a screw and putting it into a wall. Could I do it with a guitar pick? Yeah, I probably could. But a screwdriver really helps.
Well put, well put. What's like the biggest misconception someone has when getting an interface?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest misconception we see is monkey see, monkey do. I've seen so many people that don't think for themselves when it comes to this. And, you know, in some ways there's this idea of a culturally accepted option, but when you don't necessarily evaluate these things for yourself, you also don't know what you're missing out on. While you can certainly see an audio interface as just a fashion choice, to a large extent, it's also a piece of personality. And just like you wouldn't necessarily just wear a brand because it's in, you want it to somehow interact with you, you want to identify with it, it wants to match your style. Similarly with interfaces, there's so many options out there. And in my opinion, the thing that I love about these converters and why they've become essential to my workflow over the years is I really feel like I produce better work using them. I know that the microphones I'm putting into them are going to be as faithfully reproduced as possible. I know that I have the ability of powering and working with any equipment that I have under the sun.
Yeah, confidence.
It just makes
helps.
it so it's not something that's a barrier to my creative process.
Yeah,
you know?
for sure. I totally understand. Yeah, confidence. It puts you in the right state of mind to create. You know,
Totally.
And when you're not thinking about the gear and it disappears, it's your art, and that's I get it. I get that. That's cool. Right on, man. Well, thank you so much for sharing the information and your time.
Welcome.
I appreciate you.
Appreciate it, dude.
Thanks again for tuning in, you guys. Peace out.